Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for October 26th, 2022. Unfortunately, I have to tell you that cowardice and idiocy continue to dominate on both sides of the Atlantic when it comes to governments. Yesterday, we reported what seemed to be a glimmer of hope coming from a letter that was released by 30 so-called progressive Democrats calling on Joe Biden to negotiate a ceasefire in Ukraine, to engage in diplomacy instead of just war. While the letter itself was somewhat toothless and mild, it nevertheless was a break with the marching in lockstep toward the chasm of Armageddon, of nuclear war. But in less than 24 hours, they withdrew the letter under pressure from pro-war Democrats. They showed their true lack of courage and that they cannot be counted on to fight for their constituents. Further, it shows that the Democratic colleagues in the House and Senate will engage in bullying to maintain a bipartisan support for a war, even though this war could trigger a nuclear exchange. Among those who attacked the letter were, not surprisingly, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi and Bernie Sanders, the so-called senior peacenik in the Democratic Party. Now, their cowardice has been slammed by real progressives on the Democratic left. Let me give you two examples. One is a tweet from Aaron Mate, who tweeted, "For progressives, I didn't think it could get more pathetic than voting for a disastrous proxy war that the U.S. provoked and prolonged, handing billions to arms makers in the process. But in retracting their tepid call for diplomacy and blaming staffers for it, they somehow surpassed it," unquote. Then we have from Glenn Greenwald, who wrote, quote, "Imagine being elected to Congress based on promises of challenging the establishment, then being so petrified of anger from bipartisan DC establishment mavens that you can't even wait 24 hours before meekly retracting the only mild dissent you've expressed," unquote. Now, clearly, the reason that they issued this letter initially was the fear they have of a response from the American people against the war, especially with the midterms coming up. And there's been a lot of back and forth with the Republicans withdraw their support from the war. We have the example of Tulsi Gabbard, and there have been a handful of Republicans who've spoken against it. But what's needed, as we've been emphasizing, is a louder voice from the American people to put some spine in those opposing the war and to provide guidance toward a new strategic and economic policy. This was demonstrated in several interventions recently. Two young associates of mine confronted AOC and left her speechless. And not surprisingly, she signed the letter. Of course, she then withdrew her name from it when they withdrew the letter. And then yesterday, Senator Elizabeth Warren was confronted by, again, associates of LaRouche on her support for the war, even as she was grandstanding that she's helping people economically by getting debt relief from student debt. Now, let me leave the final word on the example of cowardice in submitting to the war party to columnist Caitlin Johnstone. And here's what she wrote about this pathetic episode. "The important take-home from this lesson is that progressive Democrats are worse than worthless at opposing the mechanisms of oligarchy and empire." She continued, "The U.S. has two warmongering oligarchic parties, and a tremendous amount of narrative goes into manipulating, cajoling, and coercing Americans into staying psychologically plugged into that fraudulent political paradigm." Very well said from Caitlin Johnstone. Now, what's necessary is not just anger and opposition, but a new paradigm, a mobilization to replace the war hawks and the neoliberals with an American system-style, international progressive approach of mutually beneficial cooperation among sovereign nation states. This is the new paradigm that the Schiller Institute is fighting for. And it goes far beyond mere opposition to the insanity of Biden and the British Empire and NATO. And you can participate with this in our conference tomorrow, Thursday, October 27th. It's an online conference on how to bring about the new paradigm. The Schiller Institute is sponsoring it, and it's on how to end the threat of nuclear war. Now, I will put a link at the bottom of the description section to register for that conference, but also a link to a video, comments made yesterday by retired Colonel and former Virginia State Senator Richard Black on why it's essential now that we move away from this confrontation and move to a new paradigm. Now, as for the mess in the United Kingdom, just a couple of notes on that. There's a new Prime Minister, Sunak, but what we are seeing is more of the same. The obvious point is that Liz Truss couldn't sell what the oligarchy needed, so now they're going to try someone else. So Truss and Bojo are gone, at least from the prime ministership, and they were replaced by what? An election by Tory MPs, not even the broad base of the Tory party, certainly not the British voters. So again, you have a prime minister who's, for all intents and purposes, not elected by the people of the United Kingdom. And he's given the top positions in his cabinet to the same austerity hawks and war hawks that were there before. The Chancellor of the Exchequer is going to be Jeremy Hunt, who's a hardcore austerity hawk. War hawk Ben Wallace will be Defense Minister, and James Cleverly will be the Foreign Secretary. So the policies toward the war against Russia will continue. So we see, on the one hand, Democratic Party cowardice dominating the U.S., as well as the refusal of the Republicans to fully challenge it, and business as usual from the British Empire. Now, in contrast to this is an address Helga Zepp-LaRouche gave at the Russian National Committee for BRICS Research. And Helga will be one of the keynote speakers at the Schiller Institute conference tomorrow. Here's what she said, and this is where you can see the potential for real hope. Quote, "The presently onrushing systemic collapse of the financial system represents obviously a grave challenge, but it also means a welcomed chance to finally direct the better part of the world economy on principles in accordance with those of our physical universe," unquote. In other words, what she's saying is we can now move away from the billionaires' Ponzi schemes and their wars and regime change to continue those schemes and replace them with Lyndon LaRouche's approach to physical economy, which is increasingly shaping the policy of nations in the global south, the former colonial nations, the former non-aligned nations, who are working together as sovereign nations to invest in physical economy, which means scientific and technological progress. It means modern transportation systems, a modern new platform of infrastructure, leapfrogging into the future. That's where much of the global south wants to go. They don't want to continue to be pawns of a global empire dominated by central banks and the International Monetary Fund. So help us build this online conference for tomorrow. Organize as if this is a matter of life and death for you, because in reality, it is. So thanks for joining me. See you tomorrow at the conference.